I get questions every single day about history, about politics, about philosophy, about my work, about my ideas, about the show, about the guests. And I simply can't answer all those questions or even most of them. And I'm very sorry about that. But very soon, you or anyone can ask me any question they want that I will answer at a live webinar on Wednesday, October 4th, 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Go to thaddeusrussell.com for all the information on the Ask Me Anything live webinar at Renegade University. Also, if you want to talk to me and ask me any question in person, you can come to the Renegade University weekend with Thaddeus Russell in Los Angeles, which is November 10th to the 12th. Go to thaddeusrussell.com for information and to buy tickets for both of these events. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. If you want to keep this show going and become a member of the amazing community of unregistered listeners, go to unregisteredunderground.com. When you become a member, you'll have access to a private Facebook group where you can talk with me and with guests from the show. You'll also get discounts on our new Unregistered and Renegade University merchandise. Again, to become a supporting member of the unregistered community and help me keep this show going, please go to unregisteredunderground.com. I'm very happy to announce our first sponsor. Today's show is brought to you by Mack Weldon. For 20% off your order, visit mackweldon.com and use promo code UTR. That's mackweldon.com, promo code UTR. As you're about to hear, this week's guest has been a hero of mine for many years. I think Laura Kipnis is one of the very best scholars on the subjects of gender and sexuality in the United States and has been for a long time. She's inspired much of my work, and in fact, I think she, among all academics, is perhaps the closest to my positions on many important issues. So when she agreed to do an interview with me, I assumed it would go very smoothly. Well, it did go smoothly in a sense, although it was much more contentious and even tense than I expected. However, I would also say that, to me at least, this may have been one of the most interesting interviews I've ever done. So in 2014, I was teaching at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and I went to a faculty meeting. I was just an adjunct, so I didn't really have a vote, but I was allowed to attend the meetings, and it was about 200 faculty members. These are professors in the social sciences, political scientists, in the humanities, English professors, you name it, scientists. And a presentation was given by a faculty member in political science. This is important too. She was a social scientist, so she understood the methods of social science, and she gave a presentation about the number of rapes and sexual assaults on campuses generally. And she showed us statistics from various studies that concluded that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women on college campuses at the time were sexually assaulted. But then I noticed, it was a PowerPoint presentation, there was one graph that showed that women were asked in a survey by these researchers, and it was thousands of women, college women, were asked whether you had been sexually assaulted. For one thing I noticed was that the definition of sexual assault included having sex after having a drink or two, having sex after being emotionally coerced, which is very vague, of course, having sex when one wasn't sure they wanted to have sex. It was this vague and capacious. And then the real kicker for me, though, because now they seem to have defined sexual assault as pretty much sex, the kicker for me was the fine print, which you could actually see on the PowerPoint because she had presented it very large on the screen. In the fine print, it said, there was actually a footnote that said, half of the women in the survey who we are counting as having been sexually assaulted said themselves that they had not been sexually assaulted, but we believe that they were, according to how they described their own experiences. And so not a single faculty member raised their hand, asked any questions, objected in any way to this presentation of social science by a social scientist, first of all. No one there raised the question, which I immediately had in my mind, or really the objection, which was, this is not only anti-sex, it is profoundly, I thought, and still do think, profoundly anti-feminist, because it presented women as having no agency. They don't even get to decide whether they've been sexually assaulted. So my next thought after that thought was, where are the second, sorry, not the second wave, where are these sex positive feminists who were my role models? And I really developed a lot of my ideas about gender from them. They were a handful in the 1980s and 90s, but they were influential and very important. They would have been the ones to raise those questions and raise their hands. I was also just shocked by the cowardice of the faculty at the time. I thought, but where are those great theorists? Now, it turned out that actually at that time in 2014, some of them were dead. Some of them weren't really writing anymore. But about a few months later, I saw in the Chronicle of Higher Education an article written by one of my heroes, Laura Kipnis, who criticized this sexual assault discourse on campuses in terms that I would have expected her to. And she called it sexual paranoia. And then very soon after that, she was brought up on Title IX charges for creating a hostile environment on the Northwestern campus. And there's more to the story too, but I asked Laura Kipnis to be on the podcast and she's here. So I'm very glad to talk about this and a lot of other things. I had been a huge fan, as I told you, of your work for many, many years before this happened. And then, so I wasn't surprised to see you reemerge in that particular way. So thanks for being here. And I know you're probably tired of telling the story, but I can do it for you, or we can do it quickly because it's actually sort of in some ways less important. But
the story of how I became a sex criminal?
Yep. Well, how you created a hostile environment for the women at Northwestern.
Yeah. Well, it was through writing an essay. So as you're saying, the conditions for becoming a sex criminal or a sex offender or whatever, the bar keeps getting lower and lower to the point that writing an essay can find you brought up on Title IX complaints. So that is what happened to me. So first there was the protest march against the essay, and that was kind of exciting in a way to be the subject of a protest march. And as I sort of mocked myself in the second essay I wrote, which was about the Title IX, as I put it, Inquisition, it turned out all my writer friends were jealous that I gotten marched on and they hadn't, because it does make you feel relevant when you have, and it wasn't that many students, but to have a collective of people marching against you does make you feel like you've had some impact at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always am very careful when I encounter people who aren't on college campuses who are hostile to this stuff that they see in the news about the SJWs, et cetera, and the crazy feminists and all this. Those people are there and they've always been there, but they are always a minority. And that's, I assume, your experience too. It's not, to me, my experience is what I described, which is that there will be, 5% or 10% of the faculty and the student body who do this stuff sort of actively. But the real problem to me is that, in particular, the faculty don't speak up and they're just mostly cowed. And you're the exception.
Well, it's hard to know what percentage of students are. And I agree with you. I think it is a small minority, but it's so played up in the media because the media, and particularly the right-wing media, love this story about the, the crazy students prohibiting speech and getting people no platformed and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, I do teach, and my own students, it wasn't my students who marched against me or brought me up on charges. It was other students. And, it's again, I think it's kind of media driven in some ways, because I'll go teach my classes and I'm not encountering these students who feel that I've created a hostile environment. Right. So I do think it's a small percentage, but they get a lot of press.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience too. In my classrooms, I rarely see, if ever, actually a student that I would identify as one of those crazy SJWs. I don't see that in my classes. I know they're there though, because I see them marching, but it's usually 5 or 10 or 20. And the same thing with the faculty. There's always like a hardcore of a handful of faculty, but they do tend to be the loudest, and they do often tend to not dominate the discourse among the faculty, but I do think there's a fear among faculty, a fear of criticizing them in any way, which could be used to label them sort of like you were, right, as a patriarchal sexist or a racist.
Yeah, people are afraid of that. But I think also the students have the ear of administrators, and the administrators really kowtow to them. Because one of the things I discovered was that, there had been all of these administrators, student service people, and student deans who actually came out and supported the students who were marching against me. So that's an interesting situation. You have students marching against a faculty member's publication. Yeah. And then you have administrators, this whole layer of student services people, and including these associate deans and assistant deans who are part of like the student safety, squads. But, they're in the employment of the university out there supporting the students who are marching against a faculty person. And, you could say these students are exercising their First Amendment rights and that kind of thing, which is true. But the problem is so many faculty that I talk to now are terrified of saying controversial things because of fear of getting caught up in some situation like this. Particularly people who aren't, tenured or on tenure track or are on contracts. Those people really do have something to fear if they get caught in the middle of the sort of thing that I found myself in the middle of.
Yeah. Yeah. I was one of those people. I was an adjunct. I was hoping to get a tenure track position at Occidental or something, at least permanent or full-time even. So I had there was no way I could speak up in that moment. So let's back up though. I think, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure I read about the case that you were writing about before you wrote about it, mm-hmm. which was the case of a professor at Northwestern where you teach named Peter Ludlow. I believe he was a leader in his field, which I think was philosophy, right?
Philosophy of language, yeah. Yeah, and also he had done a lot of interesting work about hacktivism and virtual communities and that sort of thing.
But wasn't he, he was sort of an internationally recognized scholar. And,
yep.
Yeah, he was a leader in that field. And so he, as I understand it, or remember, I read this at the time, even before you wrote about it, he was accused by a student, a fresh woman, first-year student, of essentially having raped her. Of coercing her into sex.
No. Just.
I guess it's been a while.
Yeah.
Something. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing quite like that. She said that he had forced her to drink and that she ended up sleeping in the same bed with him in his apartment, but no, there was no sex.
Oh, okay. I guess I thought the implication was that there had been sex, and that was really the issue. Okay. So, right.
But it's a slippery slope because once you buy a student a drink, that was part of what I wrote about. It seemed like the finding was that if he had bought a student a drink, he was capable of anything.
Mm-hmm. Had he, I'm trying to remember now, he had invited her to an art gallery?
She had invited him.
Oh boy. Okay, I completely forgot this.
She had invited him, and they went together to a bunch of art openings and other kinds of events in restaurants and bars, and she ended up sleeping at his place, and there was a dispute about who came on to who and what had happened, but there was no sex. There was a question, had they spooned, but they slept in the same bed, fully clothed, on top of the comforter.
And Northwestern's response to this was?
Well, it's a little complicated. There was an investigation and there was a kind of parsing of the events, and the Title IX officer made various kinds of rulings about what had or hadn't happened.
So what was he? He was essentially charged with something, doing something, and something happened to him, right? He was punished.
He was charged. I don't want to get this wrong, and I would have to go back and reread my own book to get the exact language.
So here's what we do know about Peter Ludlow. Am I correct? He now lives in Mexico, and he doesn't teach at Northwestern anymore.
He resigned from his position in the midst of a dismissal hearing against him because there were 2 students that had accused him of sexual misconduct.
So it's fair to say he lost his job and career because of this.
That's fair to say.
Yeah, so
that is true.
Right. So I know that you can't talk about this in detail for various reasons, but as you report in your book, but I think it's generally known now, it's public information, Peter Ludlow now lives in Mexico and no longer teaches at Northwestern and is no longer a professor. So he lost his job and his career because of these charges.
That's all true.
We can't say here, or maybe even determine specifically how and why Northwestern brought charges that resulted in them taking action to dismiss him from his job. And he was, by the way, a full tenured professor.
Well, I can say that all this is in the book. And if people want to know the details, the details are in the book. I'm constrained from talking about them now because it's publicly known there's a lawsuit pending against me. I mean, it was reported in the New York Times, so I can say that, but I'm constrained about talking more now about the case.
Mm-hmm, sure. But I mean, I guess the bottom line is, in a sense, the most important thing here, which is that he lost his career because of those accusations. Okay. And how Northwestern responded to those accusations?
He lost his career. And I mean, as I say in the book, it was my view that the investigations were conducted in a kind of capricious manner. So, I mean, professors who are guilty of sexual harassment, I am fully prepared to say those professors should lose their jobs. So, I mean, I don't think the notable thing here is that he lost his job because, to say it again and to be very clear, professors who sexually harass students or particularly in cases of, say, quid pro quo harassment, I fully believe should lose their jobs.
Okay. Can you talk about what you found you researched the case of Peter Ludlow?
Yes.
And can you talk about that? It's in your book.
Yeah, so I can to some degree talk about it.
Did you know him, first of all, before this happened?
No, I met him because he asked me to be his faculty support person at his dismissal hearing, because this was after I had gone public about my own Title IX case, and that had been in the Chronicle of Higher Education, this piece called My Title IX Inquisition. So his lawyer got in touch with me a few weeks before his dismissal hearing was going to start and asked me if I would be the faculty support person. And then he resigned after about a month. There was a number of different hearings and sessions that I observed. And then I interviewed him after that and read through all the documents in the case and, got a really, I think, pretty interesting behind the scenes view of how the cases against him had been constructed. So that was the thing that I wanted to write about, because what I think most people don't know is that all of this stuff, Title IX investigations, are completely confidential. So it's very difficult to write about this subject because there's very little documentation out there until the cases hit the civil courts. And then there's more information. But we have no idea how much this is going on because mostly people who are brought up on these complaints are constrained from speaking because even if they're found innocent, they would fear losing their jobs or being brought up on more Title IX complaints, like for retaliation, if they talk about their cases publicly. So this was a really rare case where I had access to all these documents that had been put together against him.
And what did you find in reading them?
Well, I found that, one of the big issues in the way Title IX has been enacted is the Department of Education imposed what the standard of evidence was what's called preponderance of evidence as the standard in deciding or adjudicating these cases. So that means effectively like 50-50 plus a feather is how a Title IX officer makes a determination. So what I found in reading through these cases and the reports was it just seemed to me that preponderance is an incredibly loose standard. And if you have a case where you've got one person's account and another person's account, the Title IX officer is basically guessing as to what happened if there's no other evidence. So oftentimes an accusation itself can constitute preponderance because it's such a low standard. So other standards would be like clear and convincing, which would be a higher standard. But the thing that I learned in researching all of this is that the lower the standard of evidence, like if it's preponderance, the higher the likelihood of false guilty findings.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question. I guess I have some guesses about it. I might even have a little bit of evidence to answer it, but I'm not sure, and I'm really curious about what you think. Why would the federal government impose standards like that? Why would they want, effectively, right, this is the effect of it, more professors and students, for that matter, being charged and essentially found guilty of sexual assault?
Well, most of these cases are student-on-student cases. That's the majority of the accusations. And the reason they want, and this all started in 2011 with what is called the Dear Colleague letters. And the reason, this is, the Obama administration's Department of Education and this section of it called the Office for Civil Rights. The reason is actually pretty clear that they thought that sexual assault was not being taken seriously or treated seriously on campuses, and that when usually women students made reports about sexual assault, nothing was happening. And so there, was, most people think, a really unaddressed issue. And so the reason for the lowered standard of evidence was to increase the likelihood of being able to get rid of mostly male students who were going around assaulting women students. So that's the reason.
Well, okay, but I mean, but they nonetheless redefined sexual assault in a way that defines sexual assault, as I said, and I think you agree, as, many or most or maybe even all sex acts, right? So what's the motivation? Was that just accidental, or was
Well, I think that I would want to be more precise about it than that. And that's what I try to do in the book, is sort of not make such sweeping claims, but make the claims where I think it's appropriate to make them. So the issue becomes, in a lot of these cases, consent. So like, are there situations where, let's say, guys are getting women drunk and deliberately so as to coerce them into sex or persuade them into sex? And, there are different degrees of, there's different issues in degrees there. So, I mean, I agree and have said that I think most sex is being redefined as assault, partly because there's such an issue in terms of drinking with undergrads and partying and frat parties and, sports events and that kind of thing. Like, nobody, or very rarely, are people sober at these things. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to define, as most schools have now done, sex that happens when people have been drinking as not consensual, then you're right. I agree with you. Most sex is being defined as not consensual. So yes, that's true.
I mean, so at Occidental College, in fact, I think a year after that faculty meeting, right around then, there was a case in which a first-year student woman accused a first-year student man. They had both, I think it was the first week of this semester in September, of sexually assaulting her. The college hired an independent outside investigator to essentially, do a finding on this. And that outside investigator, concluded that the sex was consensual based on text messages that were sent back and forth, et cetera. It was consensual sex. but that nonetheless he had violated the school's sexual assault policy because they had both been drinking.
Yeah. There's been a lot of cases like that.
So there's obviously a double standard there, that it's applied differently to men and women. But I guess for me, and I thought for you, and more importantly, it's saying that women essentially can't control themselves if they've had a drink, and therefore they need to be protected by the institution or some higher authority. I mean, in other words, she has no agency if she has a drink, but he does. He can be a rapist.
Yeah.
But she's just a victim, must be a victim.
I mean, I think it's one thing to say is that there's definitely a kind of going too far in this stuff. I mean, I do think it's important to say there were reasons these measures were put into place, because there was, I think, probably a lot of clear-cut assault that wasn't being addressed. One of the issues is we don't actually know. I mean, our information about this is incredibly scattershot because, like, you know about this case from Occidental, or we know about the cases that have been brought to civil suits. But because all of this is confidential and behind closed doors, we don't know the extent of the overreach. I mean, from the evidence that I accumulated, which is mostly on the basis of people contacting me after I wrote about my own Title IX case, I think there is an incredible amount of overreach. But I think there's also the case that there still are out and out assaults that are not being taken seriously. So both things are true is the problem. It's like this very contradictory situation. And there's no uniformity in how the Title IX officers at any particular campus are proceeding. And that's one of the real issues that I think it's very much dependent on who's doing the deciding as to what gets decided.
Right. As I understand the Dear Colleague letter that you referenced of 2011, the Department of Education informed colleges that they would lose their funding, federal funding, if they did not impose these particular sanctions and rules. But they left it essentially right up to the colleges and universities to adjudicate each particular case. So the colleges and universities, it's decentralized, as you were saying, as to how these things are adjudicated. But generally speaking, I think this is right. It certainly was true at Occidental and at other schools I've taught at, that tribunals, essentially, a committee would be formed which would often include, or usually would include, faculty members, staff members, non-faculty staff, administrators, and at Occidental students.
Yeah, it's
and
different.
they would adjudicate this, and it would be all secret, as you're saying, but each one had its own rules. And the thing that was really troubling to me was that, if it's a sexual assault, it's a crime. And to me, it felt to me like, why are we having, and this really happens, English professors or historians, history professors, asking students about their sexual histories? That's often how these things would be adjudicated.
Well, that happens in sexual assault cases. I mean, the thing that's uniform is the Department of Education demanding the preponderance standard. So that is the uniform thing. Each campus does conduct these tribunals differently. Sometimes it's what's called a single investigator model, or one person is deciding. Sometimes it's a panel. So that they've left it up to the schools to decide.
Right. I mean, I've heard directly from people who've been on those panels that's, at least in their experience, that's what happened. That you'd have a professor asking the accused about it was always his sexual history. And that's the fundamental problem, right, with sexual assault adjudication generally, is that there's almost never any evidence, right? Or rarely evidence, and especially in these cases. So there really just is nothing to go on in terms of evidence other than the testimony of the only people who are usually present, which is the accused and the accuser. And so that quite often, I think this is right, that's all they have to go on. So they have to, in a sense, interview them about these personal details about their lives, their sexual histories, and determine from that whether he would be predatory, I suppose, or I don't know.
So again, I'm kind of uncomfortable. Like, all right, so you know about this one incident where somebody was asked about their sexual history. I don't know about that case, so I can't comment on that.
No, I know.
So I just, I am wary about going too far on anecdotal evidence. But that's the position that we're stuck in.
Right. Oh, I agree. I completely agree. I'm not aware of any data set, right, on this, to show how many cases there were or what was done in them, because it's all secret. And there is no evidence in most cases.
Well, what the evidence we have is what's coming out in the civil cases. And there's a book that's out there called The Campus Rape Frenzy, which is not a great title, by a journalist and an academic. And they've accumulated a lot of cases that are, because there's at least 150 cases that are in civil court now, where mostly accused students are suing their schools. And what's interesting about this is that it's so expensive to do that. It's like at least $100,000, and I've heard upward up to $1 million
to bring suit against a college,
to bring a suit to go to trial. It can be like $1 million. So what that means is it's only the kids with wealthy parents who are allowed are able to do this, because nobody's taking these cases on contingency. So the sources of information are those civil suits where you get some actual account of what happened, because they're depositions and that kind of thing, or sometimes testimony. Also, the insurance, like educational insurance companies put out some reports about, like, say, how many students that they've settled with and what's your alcohol involved and that kind of thing. So there's some evidence out there. But it is tempting. I agree with you to formulate these conclusions based on anecdotal accounts. I'm just kind of worried about going too far in drawing conclusions from anecdotes.
Oh, yeah. You got to be clear that, as we're both saying here, there is no way to evaluate this objectively or broad-based. Right. And that's, but again, I think that's largely because of it all comes down to the federal government actually intervening, on this, the way the federal government forced colleges and universities to do this, and it by necessity, they have to be in secret. And so it just creates this netherworld that we have no access to as researchers. If
you're, again, to say that it was in response to like lack of action on the part of campuses, before that, and there's a lot of, again, anecdotal evidence, but that colleges were protecting athletes who were acting really, horribly, and there's a lot of economic reasons to suppress these kinds of incidents and to not deal with them. So I do understand the reason for the situation that we're in. It's just, to be historical about it, that's the history.
Yeah, and I don't, we probably shouldn't get hung up too much on this, because really what's important, I think, is the politics of it. And that's what I think you bring to this, is a political analysis of the meaning of this, and that's what I try to do too. Once you sort of figure out the politics of it, what it means and what's not so good about it politically and what can be done about it politically, then all these things will follow, right?
Well, the political, quagmire or dilemma is that it looks like the Trump administration is going to undo a bunch of this. So the people who, like me, and it sounds like you, who are not thrilled with the current situation, are in the position of it's going to be Betsy DeVos, the head of the Department of Education, and the people under her in the Office for Civil Rights, that may be dismantling what the Obama administration put into place. So that's an uncomfortable position to be in, for me at least.
Why?
Because I'm not a fan of the Trump administration, or the administration, programs or anything. But it's just an index of how completely fucked up it has been, that it looks like they may be the ones to at least insert some due process into the situation. And that's the term that we haven't used, which is due process for people who've been accused of stuff. And that's what I spent a lot of time writing about in the book, was the procedures, I mean, as they're implemented in these campus hearings, people who are accused of stuff often don't know what they're accused of until they walk into the meeting. And this is more in the case with professors than with students. There's a lot of railroading. I use the term kangaroo court a lot. So the way all this gets adjudicated is just incredibly unprocedural and capricious. So it looks like the DeVos Department of Education is looking more closely at all of this.
Yeah. So I'm no fan of the Trump administration either. But this is the latest example of the story of my life, which is that I have been forced, essentially. Well, no, I'm not forced to do anything. I will put forward these ideas about sexuality and women's agency and feminism, et cetera. And sometimes, and I know you've had this experience, people on the right will hear me, and what they hear is one of their allies. And what they'll do is they'll assume not just that I'm opposed to this particular adjudication and the way it's carried out on campuses, but that I also just reject all of feminism, and that I think that women, are biologically determined to be wives and mothers and all the rest of it. And then they pretty quickly find out that I'm a really bad guy, in fact. And so that was my experience. In fact, I was on right after this thing at the Occidental College. I was on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is has a very large audience, and a lot of the audience, not all, but a lot of the audience is kind of manly men, and some of the alt-right like Joe Rogan, and some of these anti-feminist types who don't really know anything about what's really going on campuses, but they hate feminists and they hate feminism and they hate the idea of it, and they have a caricature of it, and they have no idea about the whole history of sex-positive feminism, and they're basically sexists. They do believe that there is a biological difference between men and women, and it's all determined by birth, et cetera. That's a problem. And that the reason that I think you and I are kind of stuck in that very uncomfortable place is because the people who wrote the Dear Colleague letter, who were the heads of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, the faculty on the campuses who really push these things forward, and the administrators for that matter, and many of the students, they're all on the left in some way or another. They're liberals or they're socialists, and so they are the ones who created this. I have found in many, many years of putting forward these arguments about it, very, very little sympathy at all on the left. And the only people who will listen to it are, unfortunately, these people on the right. Some of whom, not all, but many of whom are people I want nothing to do with.
Well, I have a question about how left these people are. I mean,
yeah, me too.
don't think the direction of campus feminism is, to my mind, progressive or leftist. I mean, I call it feminist conservatism.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure. I mean, at least in terms of what I would call left, these people qualify. I mean, I did a lot of signaling in the book about my own position. I call myself a left-wing feminist. I don't know if I use the term socialist feminist or materialist feminist, but that's sort of where I come at it from. And I was trying not to play into the hands of conservatives and the right, even though I think the book has been taken up by some of those people. But yeah, so the labeling becomes kind of a problem. But I do think you have to analyze the sort of policies that are being promulgated in terms of their effects. And I mean, I agree with you. Here we agree about, I think that they actually are anti-feminist. I think they defeat the goal of women's autonomy or independence, sexual and otherwise. And as I say, I use this term feminist paternalism to describe this. So, it's hard to kind of wend your way through the labels. And, the only thing I would say is that I'm not so sure how much professors on campus had to do with this. Like, one of the things I say in the book is this commission on our campus, I teach at Northwestern, who were in charge of Title IX policy, it's like 13 different administrators. And one of the things that's happened because of the Dear Colleague letters is these incredible staffing up in colleges and universities in this area of sexual assault administration. It's a vast, I would love to know how much money is being spent in this sector and where it's being diverted from. You could call it like the sexual assault industrial complex.
Yeah.
But vast increases in staffing, administration, and these administrators, actually have more power in this area than the faculty do. Faculty have no say in this stuff, at least on my campus. There may be faculty, particularly younger faculty, who I think are on the side of this stuff, but I don't get the.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah, I don't get that faculty have much say in what's going on, and I don't think faculty actually know what's going on.
Well, they certainly do now. And I see
now because of what?
Well, just because it's been in the news and everyone's been talking about it on campuses for about 3 years now.
So I had the experience of going to a queer conference last summer, and it was before the book came out, my book, and I did a talk, and it was talking about some of the cases that I knew about because people had written to me and talking about what's going on behind the scenes. And it was an audience of left and queer and feminist professors, and a queer guy who teaches somewhere, I can't remember where, said to me, "I don't recognize my campus in what you're saying." And I said, "That's because I'm breaking news here, and all this happens behind closed doors." But these people disliked me incredibly for what I was saying. They don't believe this stuff is going on. They don't believe that there's any overreach in the Title IX area, and would say that the problem actually is sexual assault that nobody is taking seriously.
They'd actually say that you're making things up.
I don't know if they went that far, but that's certainly been said to me. Yeah. So I think. It's like you started out talking about the statistics, and it's very easy for people to throw these statistics around because they don't know where they come from. Nobody has any idea what kinds of questions are asked, or are they nationally significant, but they believe that there is this, vast problem of sexual assault, and that's the safe position to take.
I assume you brought up the redefinition of sexual assault with them. How did they respond to that specifically? When they saw how it's defined, what did they think about that?
We didn't get into that precise question, but I just remember this guy who, was a queer professor. Somebody you'd think would be aware of the problem of sex panic, sex policing, attuned to the history of, the suppression of sexuality and sexual minorities and that kind of thing. And that is also one of the things that I brought up in this talk that I did that summer, was that it's also queer professors who are getting caught up in this because the level of accusation and crime invention by students against professors, I think, is really on the rise, and that it's oftentimes queer professors who get caught up in this stuff. And so I did make those points, but I was kind of shot down.
So I didn't know about this. Queer professors tend to get accused more often, or at least a lot of them have been accused.
Well, somebody I know, a queer professor, said partly because the students who have maybe uncertain kinds of sexual identities are more likely to project those sorts of anxieties onto those people. But, in any situation like that, I think sexual minorities are more likely to be subject to accusation.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, well, so, here's, I think, pretty much a fact. The number of professors currently who are saying anything like what you're saying about this is, I could count on one hand. Two hands? Who do you know? I can think of a couple. The Harvard Law faculty.
Yeah.
Jeannie Suk and
Janet Halley
have
been
done this.
Fantastic.
They've done great stuff on this. And what was their term for it? They called it something like the sexual What's the sexual prison and or sexual industrial complex, or sexual?
I think the title in Jeannie's piece is Sex Bureaucracy.
That's right. The rise of the sex bureaucracy,
Yeah,
right?
something like
What
that.
you were describing, the rise of these huge bureaucracies and very well-paid administrators to oversee all this stuff. I mean, that's it. I don't know of anyone else who's doing this among faculty.
Well, as I mentioned, this guy who's at Brooklyn College, Casey Johnson,
but he's on the right.
No, actually not.
Well, anyway, go ahead. Yeah, I think.
No, I think. Well, they both. It's a journalist, Casey he's the professor, and the other guy, Stuart Taylor, say they were, voted for Obama. I mean, they consider themselves liberals. I think the problem was that it was the right that took up the book. And from what I understood, they couldn't get a mainstream publisher to publish it. So it's published by a conservative imprint. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they themselves would call themselves conservative. But my problem with that book was that I felt it slipped too easily into an anti-feminism.
Yeah. Yeah. I read Casey Johnson as basically being on the right, meaning the conservative right on at least issues of sexuality. So this actually kind of is a good way to
I don't know that to be true. So.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I'll present an argument to you. Okay. Not so much about him, but about what the politics of this are, I think. So I know that from my own experience, that conservatives, and I'm sure you would agree with me, what they get very upset about is that this is an attack on men, that men have become victims. And they're right. They're right. There have been many men, I think, absolutely clearly have been railroaded, have been essentially victimized, have been expelled for no good reason whatsoever. True. But that seems to be, generally speaking, just about all they care about. And so when I come at them, I say, yes, you're right. But what no one's talking about, except for Laura Kipnis, is that it is also anti-feminist, deeply. And they don't care because they're not feminists.
Right.
But that's actually what outraged me. It was sort of like I felt like people who were calling themselves feminists putting forward these ideas and policies that deny that or treat women like children, or
yeah, I think all that is
objects.
True. And I mean, I wrote that I think it's increasing women's sense of vulnerability, and I think it is infantilizing. The thing I actually think, and this is more cynical, is that what's happening on college campuses is rising female enrollments. Particularly undergrads are now like 57%, right. Something like that. Right. And there's a rising number of women in, administrative positions, and certainly staffing a lot of these sexual assault positions. And I guess I think of it cynically as a new double standard. There always was this kind of, for a long time was this mythology that when women came to power, everything would be great and there would be socialism would magically happen and things would be more equitable. And I actually think what's happening and what the right is responding to, perhaps correctly, perhaps incorrectly, is that the double standard has been flipped, and now the onus is on men and male sexuality. And, women did put up for a few millennia with a sexual double standard that was unfair to women in many respects. And I actually sort of think, okay, it's a new double standard and it's unfair to men in different ways, but equally unfair, and that's what's going on. And it's partly just demographic in terms of who has the numeric power, and given the rise of a kind of consumer orientation, some people call that neoliberalism on campus, but I mean it's certainly about appeasing students as consumers, treating them as giving them concierge service, and if the consumers are women, then making them feel comfortable and safe, and giving so I do think it's kind of a flipped double standard. And part of me sort of applauds that, okay, now you guys can see what it's like to be on the short end of the sexual double standard stick. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I do not think it's good for women.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, we need to take a quick break here. I will not do an ad for a product I don't use or don't like. When Mack Weldon asked to be a sponsor of the show, my producer Paul told me that 4 years ago, he replaced all his underwear with Mack Weldon underwear. and Paul is incapable of bullshitting. I had been wearing another brand of t-shirts and another brand of underwear for years, but that's over. Mack Weldon is just clearly better. It fits me perfectly and it's totally comfortable. In fact, I'll be wearing Mack Weldon t-shirts at the next Renegade University event. Their clothes are just designed better and are made with better fabrics than anything I've ever worn. They also have a line of silver underwear and shirts that are naturally antimicrobial, which means they eliminate odor. Also, it's very easy to shop on their website. It took me about 15 minutes to pick what I wanted, and the items were at my front door in 3 days. I'm not going to guarantee anything, but I'd be surprised if you didn't think that Mack Weldon is the most comfortable underwear, socks, shirts, undershirts, hoodies, and sweatpants that you will ever wear. But here is a guarantee. If you don't like your first pair of underwear, you can keep it and they will still refund you. No questions asked. So, you can help this show and have a much better wardrobe if you go to mackweldon.com and get 20% off using promo code UTR. Yeah, so this feminism label thing, I thought about this quite a bit. What I've been describing as sex positive feminism, which I guess we need to unpack now, but that thing, I thought through this, I'm not totally sure that those people I've talked about, and maybe not you, I don't know, but really should be called feminists. At least here's what I can't find. I really can't find hardly any feminists of any note self-described feminists or suffragists prior to about 1969 who have these ideas that women should be treated like grown-ups and they have such a thing as sexual agency, that pornography does not necessarily victimize women, etc. Right? There's nothing there. And on top of that, if you look at the origins of feminism, first and second wave, if you look at the suffragists in the 19th century, what they came out of before they won suffrage. They came out of the social purity movement, which its primary mission was to rid the earth of prostitutes. And they were responsible almost entirely for locking up all the brothels and throwing all those women on the streets.
Well, you have to also insert in that a lot of these women were economically dependent on men. So, the temperance movements and the social purity movements were to some degree protecting women and children against their husbands going out and spending, their paychecks on drink and prostitutes. So, just to insert that other side of the story for some of these women, there was, these were material issues, not just, some ideological investment in purity. But I also have made the connection between social purity movements or some kind of, Victorian thinking about sex. But I always feel like maybe it's my devil's advocate streak, to insert that these were for these women, life or death issues, or the husbands went off and slept with prostitutes and came home and gave their wives sexually transmitted diseases. Mm-hmm. So, these were also real issues for those women.
Yeah, no, it's super consistent among all those suffragists and in the social purity movement, that, they're always making that argument but here's the thing though. The argument, as you know, right, was that these women were forced by material circumstances, their poverty, to be prostitutes, that they had no choice in this. Yeah. They had no agency, right? Yeah. So talk to sex worker activists today, give them that line and they will cut your head off because that's what's used against them. They're saying, yeah, that's why we need to. People who are anti-prostitution still make that argument today. They say that women, and this goes back to the 19th century, women who choose to be prostitutes don't actually choose it. That the only woman who would become a prostitute is one who is forced by economic circumstances or who is mentally ill.
Well, most people don't get to choose the circumstances of their labor, So, there's all sorts of unpleasant circumstances people labor in, and, it raises the question of what actually is a choice. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. It's.
But again, they're sort of denying those women agency, or women generally agency, aren't they?
To me, the question is, how different is sexual labor from other kinds of labor that also may be stifling to your humanity. I'm not sure. So, I guess I would want to talk about conditions of labor generally and whether prostitution is a different kind of labor than other kinds of labor that people don't necessarily want to do, like some repetitive task in an assembly line or something. But the interesting question is, why would sexual labor be considered a different kind of labor? And I think that also is an historical question, because it has to do with when sex becomes seen as something closer to the self. So that selling your sexual labor is seen as more exploitative than selling, like, say, your manual labor on an assembly line. So, these are, I think, interesting questions. And then, morality also becomes part of the discussion. And are you more sullied in some way if you sell your sexual labor than you sell your, manual labor?
I think it's connected to what you're saying about the current sexual assault discourse on campuses, which is, I've heard you say this, that part of what's going on is that people assume that sex is dangerous and harmful.
Well, Jesus, that goes back to there's thousands of years of feeling that sex is dangerous. That's not exactly new, right? Doesn't Christianity have something to say about that? So
they started that.
Yeah, idea. So it gets reconfigured, I suppose, in different historical periods as to what kind of danger it is, whether it's spiritual danger, whether it's, for women, the danger of getting drunk and having somebody take advantage of you. So, there are all these kinds of different dangers.
Yeah, so the argument was made that sex is dangerous in the way that, heroin is dangerous. Therefore, trade in either one is trade in something that does harm to people. So therefore, we shouldn't prohibit.
I don't know. We're at some level of generality here that I'm not sure how to respond to.
Okay. I thought I was giving you your arguments. I thought I've heard this from you.
What is it that you say?
so
I wasn't recognizing myself in that.
So that I'm pretty sure you've said that not entirely, but part of what's going on with the current stuff on campuses around sexual assault is this assumption, what's driving these policies that make, all sex essentially sexual assault, is this belief that sex is inherently harmful and dangerous.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the same assumption that drove the social purity campaign against prostitution, that selling sex is equivalent to selling guns.
See, I think I would be wary of collapsing those things together and say, it's always the same sort of current, because you just want to, like, as I say, in terms of 19th century women and their economic reliance on men and the issues about sexually transmitted diseases, which, could actually kill you. So how much was that? Those were material sorts of dangers versus, I think, maybe more ideological kinds of dangers at the moment that would have to do with issues about choice and autonomy and that kind of thing.
So what is your position on sex work and its legality?
Oh, I think sex work should be legal and protected. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And don't you think that the suffragists who were part of that campaign to close down the brothels were part of what they were doing was denying women's agency?
If there were conditions then where women, the women who were the sex workers had some kinds of elementary protections, and the women who were economically dependent on, men, their husbands, had economic protections, they're just different kinds of situations. I think.
But should it have been legal for all women or just some women who were economically independent?
I don't have a position.
Really? What about today? Should sex work be illegal for some women?
The question is exploitation, and you're not addressing that. And those are real issues. So if you could have sex work in which people weren't exploited, in which there were health protections, protections against sexual violence, that kind of thing, yeah. So, I mean, I think you want to make a kind of abstract, take an abstract position. And I'm saying there are actually material issues you also have to deal with.
No, I'm just curious if you think sex work should be illegal in certain circumstances.
I think I already answered that question.
So I guess the answer is yes. And it's when there is a certain level of exploitation.
No, I didn't say I thought sex work should be illegal. I said that, like all labor, I think that there needs to be protections against exploitation.
Okay. So the state should regulate it.
Somebody's got to regulate it. And I mean, I'm for state regulation of labor, because I think that in situations where people are likely to be exploited, you do need some sort of governing agency. Yeah. So I'm not against state intervention there.
So here's where
that would include OSHA. I mean, put sex work under the direction of OSHA. That would be fine with me.
Well, so here's where libertarians think I am really dangerous and bad. I agree with you on one very important point, which is that I think that that there is not this sort of market freedom that is perfect, and it is certainly at the very least unequally distributed, so that some people have very, very few choices as to which job they can get. And I also think that there is unfreedom in a job. I think that capitalism has unfreedom within it. There is clearly a power dynamic between employers and workers, in particular when there is only one or two or three companies in town. So if you're a Mexican kid born on the border in Arizona, and Walmart happens to be the only job in town, you really have freedom. And how much coercion is there from the employer when he takes that job at Walmart and he doesn't want to work X number of hours for these wages, et cetera? Does he have power? Does he have freedom? No. So when I give this argument to libertarians, they run screaming from me. But nonetheless, I don't think I want to, or have the state regulate in any way whatever freedom that kid has to choose his conditions. But I guess I'm just a little confused. I'm hearing things that I wasn't expecting to hear from you.
Well, I wasn't expecting this line of questioning since it's not something that I actually write about. But I mean, I think it's a mythology to say that all people start out, in some position of an equal playing field.
Oh, absolutely.
And there are ways in which women are disadvantaged. I mean, they've been disadvantaged historically in terms of what kinds of jobs or labor was available to them. Certainly there were constraints on financial independence, but there's also another situation which has to do with sexual vulnerability, and men and women are situated differently when it comes to sexual vulnerability. And that's something that we have to, as materialists, or I have to, as materialists, take into consideration. And that goes back to this question about 2011 and the Dear Colleague letters and that kind of thing, which is that you would be sort of blind to reality, to certain realities, if you say that there's this completely even playing field. And for the most part, men are physically stronger than women. For the most part, women are more rapeable than men. I mean, technically, men are rapeable, but it happens physically, less of the time, physically.
And economically often. Less so now, but certainly
that's a metaphor.
No. I mean, men historically certainly have been usually in a position of economic power over women. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
I was agreeing with you.
Yes, okay, exactly. I mean, but that goes back to the purity campaigns and, men's, controlling the paycheck kind of thing. So that's why, yes, I do think, I mean, I'm not thrilled about government intervention into people's sex lives, but at the same time, you do need laws that protect people who are less empowered against people who have more power, and that includes, physical superiority. We don't want the people who are bigger and stronger taking all our money just because they're bigger and stronger. We want laws that protect our property and our persons against unequal exercises of power. And so, there is historically and kind of physically, materially distinctions between men and women. I mean, I just think we're situated differently in the world.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
So, I mean, if we don't like governments intervening in our bedrooms, but somebody's got to intervene in situations where physical force, like say, is a determining factor, or a combination of physical and sexual force.
Yeah, no, well.
And so the issue about prostitution is, I mean, that's a reality for women in sex work, or anyone in sex work, but particularly women.
That there's unequal power relations.
Yeah.
Between men and women, and between employers and employees. And
yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. And the question is, what is to be done? And so what happened in the 19th century with prostitutes, and I've written a lot about this, is, and I'm sure you know this, in the 19th century, when prostitution was essentially unregulated, there were laws always, but those laws were generally unenforced, right? So brothels operated freely in most towns, especially in the West. And those women had tremendous, certainly wealth, can't argue against that. They were the highest paid women workers in the country, and the madams were the wealthiest women in the country who weren't married to men. And because of that wealth, they often had political power, and they also owned guns, and they used guns, and they weren't afraid of using physical force against men who would try to rape them or steal from them. And they often would hire cops or private security to protect their brothels, etc. So there's this tremendous, I think, scene of women's power. And that was actually one of the reasons used against prostitutes at the time. And people called it the hierarchy. They said that this is an evil, illicit trade that these women are using and exploiting for their own advantage, and they've corrupted American politics, etc. And so the state came in, at the local level, driven by the Social Purity campaign, and took away their property, their brothels, and made it truly illegal and enforced those laws. And so I guess I see that when it was less regulated, that women intervened. And of course, this is an extremely patriarchal culture they're operating within. This is 19th century America, when this is not news to anyone, that women, of course, were expected entirely to be women and mothers only. And these women completely violated that central code in American culture and just went their own way. So I see them as correcting that power imbalance, or many of the power imbalances you were talking about. They had economic power. They controlled who they had sex with. If they didn't want to have sex with a client, they didn't have to have sex with a client because they had economic power. So I don't know. I guess is that the way I tell that history? Does that comport with your understanding of it or your interpretation of it?
I know nothing about it.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Oh, I assumed you did. Okay.
Nope.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've written a lot about this, and I've given a lot of talks about it. Yeah. I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of historians, women historians, who agree with that interpretation. That's who I got it from. There's a whole generation of historians in the 1970s and 80s, and this is important, who I think would identify more closely with the people I've been calling sex-positive feminists, who wrote those histories. They're no longer being written about the prostitutes of the 19th century. But this interview's gone in a direction I didn't expect, but it's okay. I actually like that you're fighting me. It's good. It's totally unexpected, but that's what I'm all about, is being open to ideas no matter where they come from. So I wanted to say that your early work was a huge inspiration for me. I have said this to you. And you and I actually have something in common. I think maybe we have one thing left now in common, which is that we both know personally Larry Flynt. So he asked me to write an introduction to a book he was writing about 5 or 6 years ago. And I went to what's the hotel in LA where he holds court every day? In Beverly Hills, there's a hotel, and he's there, I think, pretty much all day. And he basically uses it as his office. And there he was. I was brought in, and I sat down at the table, and here comes Larry Flynt in his gold-plated wheelchair. And then he talks to me for 2 hours about the Democratic Party and how they need to take control of the White House. So I didn't quite understand that. But you wrote an essay about Larry Flynt and Hustler that in your book, Bound and Gagged, which came out in 96, I think.
I'm not quite sure. I have to go back and
let me tell you who you are, Laura, and what you think,
right?
Because I'm all about women's agency. Well, here's my reading of that essay, which I still consider to be. There's two essays that I always tell people are.
I think it might have been 98.
Okay, there are. When people ask me what, they always ask me for recommendations for readings. I always say, well, the two greatest essays I think that have ever been written, meaning that just they're my favorites, are your essay on Hustler, which is called Disgust and Desire, or Desire and Disgust.
Yeah.
Disgust and Desire.
Reading Hustler, yeah.
Yeah, Reading Hustler is the subtitle. And Joan Nestle's My Mother Liked to Fuck, which, do you know that essay?
I don't.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah, okay.
But thanks for the compliment on the Larry Flynt essay.
Yeah, I mean, I love a lot of your work, but that thing just really, man, that stands out there. It's so my reading of your essay is that Hustler, which of course a lot of people don't know this, but in the early 1980s, there was what we now call the porn wars, and this is when certain feminists, led by Andrea Dworkin famously and Catherine McKinnon, were calling for the censorship or outright ban of pornography. And the analysis they made of pornography, I think this is fair to say, was rooted in a claim that it's really an argument that heterosexual sex was inherently patriarchal and damaging to women. And therefore, the trade in material that depicted heterosexual sex was also, following the logic, inherently degrading and harmful to women. And they were very successful. And I
think the argument was actually that it led to violence against women. I mean, that was, it was less that it was.
Well, but it was also, yeah, I mean, to them, violence was everywhere in it, meaning like they claimed that the performers it was degrading and harmful to them. And that I think Dworkin was claiming that they kind of weren't they? The ideas that were being transferred from the page of the Hustler magazine to the minds of the men, even there's sort of a violence there.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a kind of standard argument about media, that it has effects. So yeah, they argued that pornography had effects, that it, promoted sexual violence.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, they were aligned with a lot of Christian conservatives, and they were successful in certain localities in getting porn banned or censored. But the thing about that, the reason it was a porn war, was that there were some feminists who opposed them on this, and those were the ones who became identified as either as sex positive feminists or pro-sex feminists. And that was the generation, and I recommend that everyone go read them immediately, because, as I said, they were the feminism that I think is actually liberating for women. Not that I've ever been a woman, but I do think that they were the ones who were actually claiming that women's agency is a thing and that it had been under assault by anti-porn activists, and this idea that sex of any kind is inherently harmful to women. So Ellen Willis was a great writer who was part of that movement. And there was Amber Hollibaugh, and there were others as well. But anyway, I've always seen you as sort of not identical in any way, and you certainly have made original arguments in many ways, but I always saw you as sort of following on that tradition. But the thing that was depressing to me was that the origins of that movement, I couldn't trace back further than about 1970. I just don't see that line of thinking among self-described feminists before then.
Well, I actually think Simone de Beauvoir was somebody who was very interesting and,
true,
argued about.
She's French, though. It doesn't count.
Counts to me.
No, of course. But I mean, I'm talking about American and English feminism.
Yeah, but I mean, influences were varied. I mean, including psychoanalysis for some of those people. For Ellen Willis, Reichian psychology. So, I mean, I don't think it was only an American tradition that these people were drawing on. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think a lot of it came out of the New Left. So, I mean, you're not going to find some tradition I mean, in women's writing before that, because I mean, I think a lot of the second wave feminism really came out of the split with the New Left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your essay on Hustler, the argument that I see in it is that Hustler, people don't know this. So there was Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler. Those were the three dominant porn magazines at that time. And Playboy was the most mainstream one. And, you know, they didn't even show like vaginas until I think the 1980s or something. And then Penthouse was a little bit more X-rated. There was even a little bit of penetration occasionally depicted. And Hustler, though, was the most infamous example is they had a cover, I think, right, of a woman upside down in a meat grinder, and she's being
that was the one that Andrew Dworkin was
right
protested,
but they, you know, it was lots of, you know, penetration depicted, and the cartoons were, what's your word for it? I forget what you used, but nasty, kind of just dirty. You know, it's like completely uninhibited.
I think I said Rabelaisian. I was trying to make a connection between traditions of satire, you know, and particularly the use of that kind of material as an assault on like elites and elite tastes, proprieties. So I was trying to draw on like a history of pornography as a political speech.
Yeah. And so I think you argued that that Hustler actually represented, or was simply, a rebellion against elites, in particular the sort of repressive cultural regime imposed by elites. Is that fair to say? That elites, liberal and conservative, the people in government, the people who run the schools, et cetera, were telling people generally, but I guess men in particular, that, you know, sex is dangerous and bad. And so Hustler and Larry Flynt were saying, no, we're not going to listen to you, and we think you're wrong.
I guess sort of.
I mean, I had developed, before I found your essay, my own argument that was so similar. I saw in American history, at least, this consistency across the elite, whether it was Democrats or Republicans or suffragists or Martin Luther King, of sexual Puritanism.
But see, you're against Puritanism, but I mean, where would Larry Flynt be without Puritanism? I mean,
sure.
You want to be sort of dialectical about it. I mean, he requires the sense, or he requires a Puritan, or nobody would care at all about his magazine. Right. So they exist in some tension with each other. I mean, what interested me was the way that the feminist attacks on pornography had a kind of class dimension to them that I think those people weren't entirely aware of. And so their disdain for the kind of representations in Hustler, you know, had kind of relied on a sort of sense of bourgeois propriety. And, you know, Flynt was, I think, saw himself as the spokesperson for this different segment, you know, of society, for kind of more disenfranchised men of the sort that, like, now you see in the ascendancy, or supposedly, are the Trump constituency.
Yeah.
So,
right.
you know,
right.
Yeah. So that was what was interesting to me, was, you know, talking about not just the anti-woman aspect of pornography, because that had been, you know, what Dworkin and McKinnon were talking about, but also the, like, class dimensions of it.
Yeah, I mean, you could call it the return of the repressed.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
And so I think that was Hustler, and that might be Trump too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Trump's, okay, good, we agree.
the big id.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what's going on with Trump, but certainly with Hustler. But your class analysis, that was what you did. It was completely original, and I thought just absolutely not just spot on, but it really just, it sort of revealed this whole thing that no one was aware of, that second wave and first wave feminism was a phenomenon of the middle and upper classes. Now, that had been said before, but the concern there was that they were therefore only concerned with things that were important to rich women like the vote. But what you did, I thought, in that essay...
Wait a second. Sorry.
What's that?
The vote was only of concern to rich
No. I mean,
women?
well, no, that is actually the argument made by... a lot of black feminists, right? That they didn't care because they weren't going to get the vote anyway, and the state was never going to belong to them. I mean, I'm saying this was...
Yeah. I just... to collapse first and second wave feminism together, as you just did, kind of like... you're the historian. I mean, we want to go back and, again, talk about the difference between material issues, and that's what I was arguing when you were trying to get me to, be anti prostitution laws. I mean, there are material issues that women in the first wave were dealing with that I think in the second wave, they're oftentimes more symbolic issues. So, I just don't want to collapse everything together and say it's all undifferentiated. So,
right. So there's an empirical question, which is who those women were in terms of economic class. And that's undisputed that I've never heard of a suffragist on the local or national level.
Okay, that's true.
Okay,
yeah.
Who wasn't at least middle class and really often upper class. And then if you look at second wave feminism, meaning beginning in the 1960s, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, that generation, it's overwhelmingly college-educated, middle and upper class women, correct?
But I think it's a specious argument to dismiss the achievements or the struggles that those women participated in because they were middle class or upper middle class.
I'm not doing that. No.
Because I'm maybe a bit sensitive to it at the moment because you get this term privilege tossed around in ways that dismiss a lot of stuff. I taught a class on the book length essay and taught Virginia Woolf's A Room of, Her Own. And you got women saying, oh, but she was, rich. So everything she said has to be dismissed.
That's not what I'm doing.
Okay. No, I get that. But I'm just kind of saying that to use the term middle class or bourgeois or whatever, as an all-purpose kind of denunciation. I'll step in and say, but, there are actual issues. Enfranchisement wasn't nothing.
Oh, no, of course. No. I'm not saying that. No.
Okay.
And my take is different than that. I'm not sure you'll like it more. You may hate it more. I don't know. But my take is, and I took this as what you were saying, that there's just the economic class, the material basis of these women, who they were, what families they came from, et cetera, what position economically in society they occupied, right? That's empirical.
Which women are we talking about
The suffragists and the second wave, right? Okay. First and second wave share that, correct? Okay, we all agree on that. But I thought that what you added to this discussion was that they also shared what I think you call this bourgeois culture, right? And bourgeois culture, and here we go. I'm hoping this will be, finally we'll find the ground I thought was already there, that you and I think, are critics of bourgeois culture, that you see in it many things, but one of the things you see is sexual repression, the idea that sex is dangerous, inherently harmful, that it shouldn't be talked about openly, it shouldn't be displayed openly, and in particular that women are vulnerable to it, that men are inherently predators, that women are inherently prey in need of protection by a powerful institution or father figure or the state. Right?
Yeah.
Okay,
no.
So
no. So I was not making an argument against sexual repression. So that's not where I come into it. I'm not a liberationist. Yeah. I mean, what I was talking about was a sort of unconscious or less unconscious imposition of class values on the sort of aesthetics that hustlers engaged in, and that they were using grossness and bodily functions and that kind of thing as an attack on elites. So I was not interested in writing about it as a liberationist thing or being anti-repression. I'm not anti-repression.
You're not?
No, I think culture needs repression. I'm a Freudian. I mean, where would we be without repression?
Yeah.
Are you going to be fucking your sister and, the family dog and that kind of thing? I mean, culture needs repression.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too. So I think Freud's analysis is spot on, that civilization requires repression to exist. I think he's right about that.
And then you need people like Larry Flynt to, rant against it.
Oh, well, then, right.
Yeah. So, but I mean, again, those things exist in tension. So I am not and wouldn't want to be identified as a sort of liberationist, which I think separates me from some of the maybe more pro-sex people. So I've never thought of myself as...
That's very interesting. So
in that camp. And I think it's idiocy and naivete and I hear this from my students or students on campus, all this pro-sex stuff. I mean, I think to go around talking, being pro-sex is kind of idiotic. I mean, I don't think sex is entirely some wonderful thing.
Yeah. Okay. So here's my position on it. I think you might agree with this, actually. And I've stated this publicly. It's in the second page of my book. Civilization cannot exist without repression. That there have to be people, setting the rules, enforcing the rules, picking up the garbage, making sure the trains run on time, all the rest of it. There have been historically also its discontents, as Freud said. Yes. Those who, like Larry Flynt and the prostitutes in the 19th century, didn't want to follow those rules for whatever reason, but they just didn't. And it created this tension. Or often it was in opposition, as you're saying, it was a resistance to those rules, which created this dialectical tension that you're talking about. I completely agree with that. The question is, so if you side entirely with the discontents, the prostitutes and the hustler people, there will be chaos, and we're unsafe. We're not going to be able to leave this apartment and go on the streets because there will be rampaging people wanting to kill us and rape us. That's silly. And if your students are saying that, and I bet they are, I believe you, right?
Well, they're not saying that, but there's just this term pro-sex that I think doesn't, want to make differentiations.
They don't think all the way through it. Like, how far do you take this, kids? Right? Do you go all the way with that? Right. And in that case, there's mobs on the street killing us. However, if you take the other side, the civilizers, the moral authorities, the moral guardians of a civilization, then it looks like fascism.
Well, there's the question. I mean, I think Marcuse is really useful about, just necessary and surplus repression. So, I mean, you probably agree on that. So the question is surplus repression and where do you draw the line? And what are the uses to which that surplus repression is put? So I think that's probably where we agree, that whether it's the social purity campaigners or the moralists of this moment, what's the payoff of the surplus repression and to what uses is it put? So that's where I would come in, not being, a liberationist, but asking where is the line between the necessary and the surplus? Yeah,
and this is where I insist on not being abstract and in not making generalizations, because it has to be specific in that case. So I've said, if I were living in, Haiti or something, I'd probably be much more on the side of the moral guardians and the people who are interested in imposing social order, right? What I'm saying, though, in my work is that in the United States of America, over the last several hundred years, there isn't an instance in which the moral guardians, the rule makers, didn't have a ton of power and largely got their way, at least in shaping the basic contours of the society, controlling the schools, controlling the state, controlling corporations, business leaders, all the rest of it, right? So then I've never found an instance when that is a real fight that's identifiable, like between the prostitutes and the social purity campaign. I haven't yet found an instance when I'm not on the side of the rebels and the discontents. But that's specific to the United States over several hundred years. That's it. So I don't make any claims about any other place or any other time. But here, Flynt and the prostitutes and the drag queens at Stonewall in 1969 and all the rest of them, I'm always on their side. I haven't found an instance when I'm not. When I've seen them as constituting a threat to my freedom, I only see them expanding what I consider to be freedom for me and everyone else.
I would generally agree with you. I mean, to go back to, say, the anti-pornography movement, I wrote some semi-admiring pieces about Andrea Dworkin at one point, even though I disagree with everything she said.
So did Susie Bright. She wrote a very positive obituary of Andrea Dworkin. Yeah.
Because, I mean, Andrea Dworkin, I mean, I've been all over the place because I suppose I have accused her of being a purity feminist or, embarking on purity campaigns. But at the same time, I think she had a shrewd analysis of the position of women in heterosexuality. And so that's like sort of maybe a place where I might disagree with you a little bit because it goes back to the even playing field thing. I mean, she was astute about the ways that I think women sell themselves out in heterosexuality. And she herself, I guess, had been a prostitute and sort of knew that side of it. I mean, it's maybe not all the vistas of empowerment that you're extolling, and women with all this agency and guns and fucking who they wanted as opposed to who they didn't. And so some of the trade-offs that women have made, I think one would want to be sort of attuned to and sensitive to. So that's the only thing I would I would sort of interject there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you'd be an idiot or just a liar if you said that all the prostitutes of the 19th century were rich and powerful.
Right. Oh, I thought
I
you were saying
I was saying about the madams pretty much overwhelmingly were. There's no.
Well, but then those would be the owning class, I suppose, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and they were, I assume, and this is your subject, not mine, but also, exploiting the labor of the, hordes of women working.
According to a Marxist analysis, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't share that, but that's a different subject we can't do. But and I also said, all I said about the non-owning prostitutes was that they had the highest wages among American women workers at the time. That's all. I didn't say they were all wealthy, but I mean, the Department of Labor did a study because there was this panic about the power of prostitutes, and they found that the average prostitute's wage was like 4 times the wage of a construction worker at the time, in 1911, I think it was. So there's no doubt about that.
But if we're going to be materialists, I suppose I would want to know about the labor conditions too, and how much physical toll, those women were undergoing, and what their health was like, and that kind of stuff. So they, might have gotten high wages, and they also might have been incredibly abused in the process.
Yeah. So according to, and all I have is other historians, because I haven't actually done much of the primary research myself, so I'm actually summarizing other historians, but according to most historians of prostitution during that era, the brothels were where women workers got benefits like healthcare provided by employers, got housing provided by employers, because there was such the supply and demand, right? There was such a demand for them and very little supply, largely because of the moral proscriptions against this occupation. And so that women workers didn't get any of those things, any of those benefits outside that industry. And so it really was kind of just an exceptional place for women. But were the madams capitalist employers? Totally, absolutely. And were they, taking, and Marx would say, I guess, surplus value from their work, I suppose. I mean, according to Marx, absolutely, completely agree with you, and you apparently. But the thing that's, I guess, again, it's all about agency. And there will always be unequal relations, I would think. That any two people together, there will be unequal power relations, whether it's us talking right here or an employer.
Who has the power?
I don't know. I'm not sure. These things change too, right? They're dynamic, but or it's a cop and a black kid in Compton, there's going to be, or even if it's, two people of the same economic class and from the same school and all the rest of it, there's going to be unequal power relations in bed between men and women. Who knows? It will always be unequal, I think. So then what do you do about it? I mean, do you attempt to impose something from outside that relationship to equalize the relationship, right? Either through the state or through moral suasion or whatever it is. And it just seems to me that every attempt, at least historically that I'm aware of, and I think maybe in the abstract, this is necessary, any attempt to do that denies people their agency. It's also, I find it to be paternalistic.
But there's another issue, and I'm thinking of, there's this piece I read that Martha Nussbaum, of all people, wrote, the feminist philosopher, in maybe it was Salon a few years ago. I don't know if you came across it, where she's talking about an experience she had when she was younger. I think before she was had her PhD. I think she might have been in acting. I think she was in the theater for a while. And she went to bed with a guy, and she doesn't name him, but it turns out to have been, because you can find this information online, the guy who was the father in the Waltons. He was like in a local play production. She'd met him, and they have sex, and she doesn't like say it in complete detail, but apparently he was incredibly rough. I mean, they went to bed together, equal agency. Right. She thinks she's, on the same terms as he is, but he's bigger than he is. And I read this a while ago, but it was something in between consensual sex and rape. Right. Like, he did stuff she didn't want him to do. She was injured. It was rough. There's no, it's not the kind of thing you could exactly go to the police about, particularly then. I think maybe now, if somebody abused you sexually, you could go to the police. But it's a kind of gray area. Yep. And I mean, this goes back to the campus situation and the sex that people are having. That's right. The subject I know more about. That there are these gray areas, which I think there's this desire now for there to be some kind of adjudication or recompense or way to deal with stuff that actually is ambiguous in terms of what happens between people in bed. It was fascinating to hear Martha Nussbaum, of all people, who's thought about as, the queen of one of the queens of philosophy and academia in general, talking about a situation where she was, she didn't have agency because that situation, there's some inherent kind of inequality in it, I guess. So, I mean, I think that sort of complicates and maybe fucks up a little bit some of the claims you want to make about the autonomy or that, say, prostitutes have had, or the ways in which, we have agency and, because and I don't have an answer. I'm not saying a government agency should step in, or the courts should, or Title IX officers should. But I also kind of recognize, and I think it's dishonest not to recognize, that there's a lot of sex that happens in ways that aren't equal for women. And
what I'm saying is all sex is unequal.
Maybe, but the tendency is that it's men that have more control in those situations, or at least if you read women's accounts, for all sorts of reasons having to do with socialization, with physicality, with maybe different capacities for alcohol consumption, women, I think, often end up feeling like the loser in those situations. And so I think it's more, maybe somewhat useful to think about some of these campaigns, whether it's purity campaigns, Title IX, legislation, etc., as some way to ineffectually maybe try to insert some recompense or some method for dealing with these inherent inequalities that nobody really knows how to talk about and certainly doesn't know how to deal with. So I look at some of this stuff as symptoms as opposed to just, this is right, this is wrong. So I think that's where some of my frustration with this conversation is. It's not about, taking a side. It's about looking at these things as symptoms of something that can't be expressed otherwise.
Okay, but it sounded like, maybe I'm wrong, it sounded like you were sort of taking a side, though. And let me just ask you, are you saying that generally speaking, or more often than not, that the woman in a sexual relationship has less power than the man?
I'm going back to the situation that Martha Nussbaum wrote about. I think that that's probably a pretty common situation, that at least women feel in those situations unable to make the situation go the way they want it to go. They feel overpowered, whether it's physically, emotionally, sexually, whatever, and that's a reality. And, you can talk in sort of like abstract, highfalutin terms about we're all equals or whatever, but I think there's a reality to sexual inequalities that I don't think anybody talks about that much, partly because it goes against some of the current thinking about where everybody wants to be pro-sex and talk about women, women's sexual agency, and, none of us want to be Puritans and that kind of thing. But, I just think that there are these realities that, where I end up in the book is talking about education and doing a better job of being open about these kinds of realities, because I think they're very obscured in the contemporary conversation. And so I was just very interested. Martha Nussbaum wrote this piece about this experience she'd had as a young woman, that there, was had an impact on her, and that there isn't really exactly a way to address.
So what do you prescribe?
I don't prescribe. I don't know.
Oh.
I mean, I don't. There's. No, I don't think
for campuses. I mean, for the campus adjudication process, or just the whole regime itself. What do you want to do?
I think there has to be more realism in the conversations about what sex is really like, and I think that women students get to campus as freshmen. They go to parties. They get completely plowed. They end up having sex that probably doesn't feel that good. And probably some of the time they're going to a Title IX officer and saying, this wasn't what I wanted to happen. And you've got Title IX officers then going into some sort of overdrive about bringing guys up on, Title IX complaints and putting them before tribunals. And so it's easy to say all this is horrible overreach, and I think in many cases it is, but I also think there's some underlying realities nobody wants to talk about.
Well, okay. I mean, I've heard you say that about what should be done, just to talk about sexual relations more realistically. And again, when you say realistically, of course, there's an assumption in there about what is realistic, but and I'm all for talking about sex as frankly as possible and all things. And I think that certainly does not happen on campuses. Yeah. I think in fact, maybe most importantly, in academics work. So when I was at Columbia in graduate school in the U.S. History Department there in the 1990s, I read how many books on American history? 500, 1,000, I don't know. How many articles? How many lectures did I attend? I am telling you, not once did sex come up. And I was thinking, wait, haven't the shrinks told us for a long, long time that this is what people think about all the time, and it's central in civilization and all that? It was quite remarkable. Now, of course, since then, there's been more academic work on sex, but it's still a minority among us who do this work. So I'd start there among the grown-ups and the work they do, and how would they talk about it? But I've heard you advocate. Actually, you said, I think you called for mandating self-defense training for women, which I think you actually did that, right? When you were in college?
I was after college. I was in my 20s. But I took 2 self-defense classes in the second one where you broke a board with your foot, you kicked a board through with your foot as the graduation ceremony. Yeah, I absolutely think women should take self-defense. Yeah. So I do martial arts, and it's like combat sports. It's like, not just for show or whatever. It's like, these are sports where you are trained to do what is most effective, meaning most, violent, essentially, right? And there are lots and lots of women in my gym now, and all the gyms I've been a part of, and it's the most inspiring thing when I see them, when they're good. When they're really good, to me, that is the other side of what I think feminism is. I mean, it's a woman who you cannot fuck with. And they could be 100 pounds, and if they're good at particular martial arts, they'll make a 200-pound linebacker unconscious in a second. Yeah. He's not raping. They are not going to get raped. But even in that situation. Even beyond the necessity to use the physical skills, I think it probably changes your subjectivity if you feel you can defend yourself. And the thing that's been shocking to me is I've read a lot of women's accounts and women students' accounts of what happens, is this idea that they don't know how to say no. And you would just think that 30, 40 years after second wave feminism, women should know how to say no when they don't want to have sex. Yes. And instead they're like, okay, go ahead, get it over with, or they don't want to make a fuss or that kind of thing. And that's what's shocking about all of this. So there is, and that's why I still go back to Andrew Dworkin as an interesting writer, despite disagreeing with everything that she writes. I still think there's, she had, I think she saw sort of clearly something about women's abjection in sexual situations. And it's something that's not popular to talk about, but you see the consequences of it in these futile attempts to regulate like sex on campus or regulate drinking or whatever, because, the drinking does realistically, and I wrote a chapter about this in the book, realistically, it deprives women of a sense of agency even more. They already, feel not agentified, to say an ugly word.
I have no doubt whatsoever that many, many, many women don't say no because they don't think they should or can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. No doubt about that. Then the question, right, is what should be done, though? And I think that's what we have to answer. And to me, it ain't easy. I'm not saying it's easy to do this, but I believe that it has to come from them. Whatever is to be done has to come from them.
Them, the students?
Women.
I'm a them.
Yeah. I mean, in other words, if you feel like you can't say no, and that's what's stopping you from determining your life, your sex life, your life generally, we can't do it for you. No one else can do it for you.
I am not a big fan of the what is to be done conversation because I think that it's premature and you first have to figure out what the problem is. I mean, what I'm saying that I see as the problem is not, I don't even think that discussion is being had. So I think at first you have to identify what's going on. And I don't mean through statistics. I mean, that's the problem with this, you started out with statistics with the campus assault situation is people are throwing these statistics around as though there's some reality we all understand. And it was when I started trying to look behind the statistics by interviewing a lot of students, talking to my own students, reading what women were writing online, that I found out much more about the realities of the situations for younger women. So I don't think we can talk about what's to be done before we know what's actually happening. And to say that women don't know how to say no is not the most obvious thing at this moment in time. I think there's a kind of assumption that we're past all that, but we're not, I think, from what I've learned.
Yeah. Yeah. I just sure hesitate to, I don't hesitate. I refuse to help them, save them, do anything to shape their own destiny.
I think we're educators. We
except to say, liberate yourself.
On campuses, part of what you're doing is trying to provide people with an education, and this, I don't think this isn't part of an education. It's an education on how to move through the world as a person. And so to say, people should rely on themselves may sound good, but it's not exactly helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think we do agree that at least that we all on college campuses and in the society generally should just talk more about sex and sexuality and more openly and be as honest as possible. And I certainly think at the very, very least, that's been the work you've done over many years. And it's, you may not know it or believe it, but it has certainly, I think, influenced me and contributed to my own thinking. So
thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
I am actually glad that we had some tension and some.
I just got annoyed at a few points in the conversation, but I hope I didn't seem, unfriendly in my annoyance.
No. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what a good intellectual does. That's what I demand, actually. I don't want to hang out with people that don't do that, as a matter of fact. But I guess maybe I'm not who you thought I was, but but that's for you to decide. So anyway, thanks for doing this. I really, really do appreciate this.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, that was interesting.
This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. If you want to become a supporting member of the Unregistered community, please go to unregisteredunderground.com. For information on the upcoming Ask Me Anything live webinar on October 4th, go to thaddeusrussell.com/AMA. And to find out more about the special weekend with me in Los Angeles from November 10th to the 12th, go to thaddeusrussell.com/Los Angeles. Thanks for listening.